It's time for another episode of I Am Northwest Arkansas, the podcast covering the intersection of business, culture, entrepreneurship, and life in general here in the Ozarks. Whether you are considering a move to this area or trying to learn more about the place you call home, we've got something special for you. Here's our host, Randy Wilburn.
Hey folks, Randy Wilburn here from I Am Northwest Arkansas. Excited to be with you as always. We have a special episode for you this week. We have an event that I've been fortunate enough to be a part of for the past few years, which is the ULI NWA Place Summit. That is an event that focuses on placemaking right here in Northwest Arkansas. I've been here 10 years now, so I'm not a newbie. But one of the things that I've recognized is the importance of being intentional about the space that you are in. And ULI does that at such a high level all around the country, but they certainly do it right here in Northwest Arkansas. I've been involved with ULI for a number of years. Even before they did this Place Summit, I've always found it very interesting. The work that they do, the people that they connect with, and the thought leaders that they have brought into this space that we call Northwest Arkansas to be confident in our approach to how we grow this region. And I think that's the easiest way for me to describe it. Today, our next guest is helping communities across the country build resilience in the face of climate change, among other things. And we are so excited to have her as a featured speaker at the upcoming ULI NWA Place Summit happening November 20th and 21st at the Record in downtown Bentonville. If you're listening to this after the fact, you should still tune into what the ULI NWA is doing here in this area and follow Alison Sant. Alison Sant is an artist, a designer, and author of the book From the Ground Up: Local Efforts to Create Resilient Cities. She has drawn on years of experience and over 90 interviews. Alison showcases inspiring projects that blend sustainability with equity. From green infrastructure to urban forestry and revitalized shorelines, Alison demonstrates how positive change starts at the local level. Please join us in welcoming Alison Sant and Megan Brown to the I Am Northwest Arkansas podcast. How are you guys doing today?
Great. Thank you so much.
Absolutely.
Thanks, Randy.
Absolutely.
Great kind words about ULI. Thank you. We're always great to have you as an ally.
Yes. And I apologize. I didn't give you enough credit, Megan. Megan is the brains behind ULI NWA. Yes. Wes Craiglow is the executive director, but Megan makes everything happen. And, you know, Wes was actually out of the picture for almost 2 years serving our great country. And you would have never known it because Megan is just so good at what she does. I want to give you your flowers right now because you are amazing at bringing together so many different groups. You mentioned some of the people that you brought, Majora Carter a couple of years ago, Daniel Parolik, and so many others to this region to have the conversation that needs to happen. Our guest today is no exception to that. I applaud you, Megan, for what you and your team does to really make a difference here in Northwest Arkansas. But Alison, this day is about you and about the work that you're doing in our communities. I would love for you to give an introduction to yourself for our audience so they can understand who you are. Those listening to this before the actual Place Summit event can get tickets. I understand there's still space left, but it is going to be the biggest Place Summit held here in Northwest Arkansas. If you're listening to Alison today and you're moved by what she's saying, come out and meet her in person. Without further ado, Alison, why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself to our audience?
Sure. Well, thank you again for this opportunity. I'm really happy to be here and very much looking forward to the summit. I've had a lot of different iterations in my life, and I came at being an urbanist through the lens of being an artist and working in documentary photography. And I've also taught and now writing books. So I've been very lucky to explore a lot of different ways of working. One of the best expressions of drawing on all these capacities is the creation of the Studio for Urban Projects, which I co-founded in 2006. It was the generator of a lot of things that have come after that. It was a hybrid, not only my own disciplines, but also the talent of my colleagues that I work with and collaborated with. Our project worked at the intersection of architecture, arts, social activism, and we were able to bring a wide set of tools and really focus them on the change that we wanted to see in cities. We began the Studio for Urban Projects at a time when many cities were being shaped by what have been called tactical urbanism, tactical experiments. Like in 2009, Times Square was close to cars and pedestrianized. And that was like one of many kinds of experiments that have been going on in cities throughout the United States, throughout the world, really. So we worked to enliven public spaces. At the time, we were working in San Francisco. We made playgrounds and abandoned plazas, and we made community event spaces on underutilized sidewalks, and we chalked up temporary bike lanes on the street and even made oyster reefs to adapt the shoreline with the same iterative processes used to think about the fabric of the city. And, we really, in all of those, in that work, brought the public together to discuss the future of cities. And through that work, I really come to believe that cities are the place to act. The cities are the place where the majority of us live as the world's population is tipped to urban. They're also responsible for 75% of global carbon emissions. So how we live in cities really matters. We need to cut our emissions by half by the end of this decade to avoid the worst effects of climate change, but many of us have experienced them already. Extreme storms, wildfires, extreme heat, and flooding. So I really do what I can in my work to bring all the tools that I have to exploring the ways that we can mitigate and adapt to climate change. And also to create that work as an opportunity to improve cities, to look at how they can become more equitable and livable places at the same time.
Yeah, I love that. As I'm listening to you talk, I'm thinking, man, there's no degree that you could go to a college to take to do what you're doing right now, right? When you think of the intersection of you as an artist, designer, author, and a teacher, how have those roles influenced you over your career?
Yeah, so the hybrid practice that we grew at the studio really came out of that idea that no single discipline can address the challenges we face. We need all of them. Studio was one way of doing that. I was drawing on my practice as a documentary photographer, where interviewing people and convening people as an urbanist have been ways I've worked for a long time. It's been a wonderful thing to bring into my writing as a way of doing primary research, to understand people's lived experiences and their expertise in a way that nothing else can. It's been responsible for my commitment to centering equity in my work. As a result, I interviewed more than 90 people when I wrote from the ground up, which was an enormously rewarding experience and really helped me understand what's needed. I also want to acknowledge that I'm a parent, and being a parent has deeply shaped my commitment. There's nothing like the realities of climate change when you're thinking about the children that you have and the way that they'll inherit the decisions we make today. My kids have also helped me to see the world in a different way and through their eyes. I actually wrote a piece about this in the opening to the book because it was so foundational. If you'll allow me, I'll read just a little section of the introduction.
Please.
So on September 21st, 2007, I took my then 2-year-old son, Ben, for a walk. I was living in the south of Market Street neighborhood in San Francisco. It was a part of the city overwhelmed by fast-moving cars and cut through with on-ramps and highways. Soma has one of the highest number of pedestrian and bicycling deaths in the city and is one of the neighborhoods with the least access to public open space. Unlike many of the city's residential neighborhoods built with Victorian apartment buildings and houses so familiar to tourists, Soma contained industrial buildings, many having been converted to spaces suited to artists and designers. My husband, Rick Johnson, and I could house our wood and metal shop and design studio there, plus trade-off parenting, all under one roof. The only hard part was going outside. But on that September walk, everything changed. Some friends, John Bella, Matthew Passmore, and Blaine Merker, who had created a design collaborative called Rebar, proposed that we all participate in the redesign of our cities, repurposing spaces used to store cars to create public places of our own design. Each participant paid the parking meter, but instead of using it to park a car, they used the space to create a park. Ben and I found out just what this effort could mean in a neighborhood that had neglected its public spaces. Just a few blocks away from the warehouse where we lived, we came across our first stop on the corner of Folsom and 8th Street, where a small nonprofit organization, Garden for the Environment, had installed some plants and benches as well as some large buckets of soil. We stopped, and while I learned about household composting, Ben ran his chubby fingers through the imported earth. We got a waft of the dark, pungent soil, and even among the stream of cars going by on 3 lanes of traffic, we were buffered by the experience of a garden. Soon, Blair pulled a few wriggling worms from the heap and put them in Ben's hands. Ben's giggles and delight were infectious. Standing on this intensely urban corner in roughly 140 square feet, he was having an experience of nature. And I think this passage in the book is one that recurs, and often experiments start small and then scale up. We at the studio and Rebar were all part of what that looked like. When I think back to those days, Parking Day has really scaled, right? It engendered the city's first official parklet program. And when there was something like 80 parklets right before the pandemic, which seemed like a lot at the time, in the time of emergency, parklets became a huge and important way for us to do just about everything, from shop, go to school, and eat. And it was all on the street. And the last I checked, it was something like the city was close to 2,000 shared space permits across San Francisco. But we know that parklets have been spread internationally. You see them in so many cities. So this looking at the possibility of our urban streets, not only as a designer and an urbanist and a person interested in people's lives, but also as a parent, has been really instructive to my practice and ongoing work.
Man, that's actually really interesting. I didn't catch that you were from the Soma area where I lived for a while. I used to work down on towns between 2nd and 3rd, so I know that area quite well.
Wow.
It has changed a lot in the past 20 years since I've been there. The inspiration you speak of in the book has been the catalyst for a number of projects that you have documented from around the country. And I'd love for you, through the Studio for Urban Projects, you guys have produced over 100 events, bringing the public together with advocates, scientists, civil servants, academics, designers, and artists to discuss the future of cities. Can you share maybe one memorable story? You've already given us one great story, but can you share a memorable story from one of those events that grew out of your original experience?
Yeah, absolutely. Full one thing. We had hundreds of events over the years that we hosted. And I think when I think back to it, I was mentioning that we ran a storefront in the San Francisco Mission District for many years. We hosted talks, we led multiple tours, and we also did a number of projects that engaged the public. When I look back on that work, one of the most rewarding for me was crafting a project called The Outpost. To provide some background, the San Francisco Planning Department and Yerba Buena Center for the Arts works together to put on a 3-day event, reimagining San Francisco's Market Street, the central spine of the city, the main transit corridor. And it's also an area, we were a project team, and our work was centered on Market and Sixth, which is adjacent to the Tenderloin. The Tenderloin is a neighborhood in downtown San Francisco, and I wrote about it in the book coming out of this project. It's one of the most racially diverse populations in the city. It has the densest housing, and it's home to many families and seniors, but the majority of them live below the poverty line. It has more children per capita than any neighborhood in the city. At the time, the neighborhood really didn't have adequate access to public parks and open spaces. And even when there were playgrounds, often, the tenor on the street, there's a lot of drug dealing and a lot of drug using on the street. Those playgrounds weren't necessarily accessible. So we worked with a set of community partners to create a temporary community center on the street. The space was governed by this kind of player piano calendar. It was 72 hours of programming, all created with partners from, that were local arts organizations, local businesses, neighborhood advocacy groups. And the design of the space was something that could be easily adjusted to host everything from a plant and art workshop to a nature playground or a pop-up library or a bike kitchen, and lots of talks and film screenings. I hosted a daily radio broadcast from the street where I invited people, often hidden behind city walls in City Hall, dreaming of ideas for the city. I wanted to bring them into the street and the place they were considering to talk about the future of Market Street. So we hosted the first ever BioBlitz along Market Street. It turns out that there's all these Western tiger swallowtail butterflies that love Market Street. We got a group of citizen scientists who are all signed up using iNaturalist to go out and track the Western tiger swallowtail and other species that thrive on Market Street, a kind of unlikely habitat. It was really fun, I'd say, through all of those collections of events to create a platform for exploring the range of ways that we could use Market Street and making it possible for people that lived there, that were attached to the community, that participated in a planting workshop and then took it home to make their own community garden. They made it possible for us to host those events and to understand what was needed in the neighborhood, but also it made it possible for them to manifest their vision. So this 3-day event turned into another longer-term project where the outpost came back. It was slightly reconfigured. We iterated the design, returned it to the street, and we ran it for several months, hosting community programs. So that was just a simple example of many of the kinds of projects that we did, but that really helped me to understand the breadth of what communities can offer and also how design can be directed by community leadership.
Yeah, I love that. And one of the things as I was sitting here thinking about that is that doing or undertaking any of these types of events requires a lot of buy-in and a lot of different people getting involved. And I know Megan's probably listening to this with rapt attention in terms of how you developed the buy-in of the different disparate parties that are involved. And so when I think about your work specifically, it involves collaborating with diverse groups of people, including community activists, government officials, and designers. Building upon what you just shared, can you share a story about a successful collaboration that led to a positive impact in the community where you really worked hard to bring these different groups together?
I mentioned earlier that we had prototyped adapting shorelines. So in reflecting on this, I think this is a very recent project, but it's also been kind of going on for a number of years. There's cities throughout the country that participated in Rebuild by Design. And in the Bay Area, it was called the Resilient by Design Bay Area Challenge. And when the context of that is it really came out of New York City post-Hurricane Sandy. And it was an effort to sort of take all these different groups, as you pointed out, like government officials, advocacy groups, community-based groups, designers, put them all together and get them to think about really complex problems and how you can drive solutions. In every city they've worked in, it's been over, extended period of time. And then many of those teams continue to work on those projects as funding unfolds. We were part of a team with other design firms and academics. Bionic and WXY were on our team, as was a scientist named Catherine Boyer, who we'd been we'd worked with her in provisional ways for a while, but this was the first time we got to work together at kind of a real capacity. And she is the lead scientist for the Estuary and Ocean Science Center based in San Rafael. Our work was based in San Rafael. We focused on the Canal District, which is an extremely low-lying part of the Bay Area region. It's one of the most vulnerable communities to sea level rise and flooding. And it's also a neighborhood that's served as a new home for immigrants that are arriving from Brazil, Africa, and the Philippines, and the Middle East, and Latin America, Vietnam. So we, and many of those families live below the federal poverty level in this part of San Rafael called the Canal District. At the edge of the Canal District is this park called Pickleweed Park. We created this modular oyster reef system that was host to the native Olympia oyster there. It was intended to design something that 2 women scientists could carry on their own into the water and deploy, and that it didn't need cranes because they were spending too much money on cranes and hoisting these big units into the water. And then we also wanted to be something that could be iterated. Could you add to it over time? Could you learn about how oysters recruit and then change the structure? And so that's actually in the water now and is directly offshore from this park. And it really tests the benefits of oyster reef systems to buffer waves and storm surge. But it also is this incredible resource for natural habitat for the fish, aquatic plants, and the wildlife of the bay. And so we created the project, but we also worked with community-based advocacy groups like Canal Alliance and the Canal Welcome Center and Resilient Shores to create what were called the Living with Water tours, which were a series of walking, biking, and kayaking tours that brought public awareness to the effects of sea level rise, especially on this frontline community. The tours engaged the public in conversation with scientists and designers and planners and government officials businesses, advocacy groups who are all working to make San Rafael resilient. So we wanted to make that process transparent. And then we also worked with a group called the Conservation Corps of North Bay, which is a youth-centered job training environmental leadership program, which enrolls many of its students in the Canal District. So they're essentially learning to make these reef systems that will protect their community. They assisted with the fabrication of the reef systems, and it's part of their ongoing training in job training for greater resilience. San Rafael is just one of the installations that we created throughout the Bay, but it's been showing real promise, as the other installations have, that reef systems can actually substantially reduce wave energy, and they're likely to have even greater effect as the project scales up and you do larger reef systems. The project is really exciting because it really engages in public education and workforce training and matches that with science and design and creating solutions that help communities adapt to climate change. We need everyone involved in dreaming up and determining the solutions for the challenges ahead. This is one of the projects that we created, and there's a lot of nature-based in the book. From the ground up, there's a lot of nature-based solutions all over the country, not only in the Bay Area, but also in places like Louisiana and here in New York City, where I live today.
Well, there's so many different places that I could go with this, because you're giving me so much great information. And I'm thinking about, a lot of times we are typically only aware of what's right in front of us, right? Like what's in our little corner of the world. Sometimes it takes different viewpoints and programs to create greater awareness around how our environment's being impacted and how we can play a role in the impact of our environment. I'm curious to know, for you, with your varied experience, what is the most surprising or unexpected thing you've learned about cities in general and their resilience through your research and work, right? Because when you think about this, a lot of times we hear news stories and we read reports, and a lot of times we feel like we're going to hell in a handbasket, but that's not really the case, because there are a lot of people out there making a difference, like yourself and a lot of your peers. I'd be curious to know, too, with regard to the resilience that you've unearthed through a lot of the places that you've studied and worked.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think what was surprising to me about writing the book and going through the process of researching it and looking at all these projects throughout the country was that I came away feeling that social infrastructure should really be the purpose of physical infrastructure. We often focus on the material things that we can do to the projects, the built infrastructure that's going to change things, but often investing in the capacity of people and the solutions they come up with is the most important piece, because those people can keep coming back to the reinvention of what's needed. It's not like a one thing. And certainly as we go through the rest of this century, what we need is going to shift and change. Social infrastructure is something that I came to understand better through many of the projects that I was looking at. But it was also really informed by the work of Eric Kleinenberg, who ended up speaking at the conference last year and is really a mentor to many of us in this field. His early work measured the health outcomes of extreme weather in Chicago. He was looking at the Chicago heat wave in 1995. And he determined that the people that knew their neighbors, that had someone to go check in on them in time of emergency, the people that knew each other fared so much better in a time of crisis. I thought that was a really stunning way to look at it, that if we use all the processes that we need to undertake meeting the challenges of climate change, we also have this tremendous opportunity to connect to one another. We're recording this a week before the election. And I think about this a lot because we're in a time that's so polarizing. Social media has stuck us in our silos where we need places and we need people. I've been looking at 34th Avenue in Queens, and it's a great example of this, and so many other projects. We need places that bring us together and air the diversity of our experiences and help us see our common plight. I think that democracy thrives when there's a forum instead of a soundbite for it. I really believe that social infrastructure is one of the most crucial pieces of our future resiliency and our democracy. If you'll indulge me, this is one piece I wrote days after the January 6th attack, because that happened kind of while I was wrapping up the book. In the very conclusion, there's a paragraph that I'd love to share with your audience. This book is a call to action. When we make the places where we live more porous, lush, and alive, we need to make them socially just, resilient, and self-directed. In so doing, address the history of injustice. We must invest in the under-resourced communities first, providing not only transit routes, bike lanes, green spaces, and parks, but also affordable housing, jobs, and public education. Together, these actions represent investment in the capacity of people. Informed by a shared base of knowledge about the environmental reality ahead, they may envision and direct the plans that are acted upon by policymakers, urban planners, and practitioners. Government officials, nonprofit organizations, and community-based groups and individual advocates may build alliances to support and embolden this vision together. It's a recipe for how we restore and reinvigorate the democratic process and move forward to creating the resilient cities that will be essential to managing the storms ahead.
That gives me goosebumps listening to that, because I want to add to what you just shared and the example you gave from Eric's talk last year and some of his research in studying Chicago. I don't know, Megan, where you stand, but that was one of the biggest takeaways for me last year at the summit. I'm going to tell you what I proceeded to do afterwards. I think people listening to this might appreciate it. Take it for what it's worth. I started checking in more with people. And during the course of the last year, I've actually had a few elderly neighbors pass away, because people are going to die, whether we like it or not. The reality is that sometimes people die silently, meaning that it's almost like it never happens. It's like you just keep life keeps going on. And I made a real commitment after hearing him talk last year that I was going to be really intentional about connecting with my neighbors, if for no other reason, just to check on them, right? I know a lot of us did it during the pandemic because we had elderly neighbors that couldn't get out for fear of getting COVID. But just in general, it's part of being a good neighbor that can be the difference of life or death. And I don't think that should be lost on anyone. His findings and his research really struck a chord with me and reminded me that we, as much as you alluded to, that we're in a very highly partisan era, that we are much more connected than anyone realizes sometimes.
Yeah. Randy, there's Eric continued to go on, and I mentioned 34th Avenue, and he continued to go on. He's written Palaces for the People in 2020, and he ended up covering some 34th Avenue in Jackson Heights, Queens. I've been following this group for a while, and it's a part of a new book I'm working on called Street Life. Jackson Heights in Queens suffered some of the worst effects of the pandemic. It had some of the highest mortality rates in the borough. People live in tight quarters, so there wasn't enough space for them to go outside. There was a city-run open street. The next book is called Street Life, focusing on the public space of streets. Even though there was this open street, not everyone felt safe using them. It's a really diverse neighborhood. There's something like 167 languages spoken in Jackson Heights. And they, when they would go out, there'd be like police and barricades, and they felt like it was more like a checkpoint than an invitation to occupy the street. And so de Blasio considered it a failure, and they canceled it. But the neighbors got together and organized the 34th Avenue Open Streets Coalition, where they closed a block of the street. And they ended up gathering there as a group and demonstrating how you make an open street and calling the media. And since then, that one block during the pandemic has now become 26 blocks. It's the longest open street in New York City. It is this tremendous place where there's like community bike rides and after-school hula hooping classes, games of Sapo, exercise classes, and performances on the street, and neighbors get together to celebrate the holidays. There's a huge mutual aid program there where there's food and clothing distributions. During the pandemic, they were giving away resources to neighbors. There's also been legal advice for asylum seekers. Nuala O'Doherty is one of the founders of this coalition, giving legal advice to people that have newly migrated to New York City. This project has been really resonant for me because it highlighted something that came up from the ground up and contributed to its title. It's also continuing to resonate in my work going forward, which is that the most effective solutions are born out of the communities they serve. For the community of Jackson Heights, that open street is now essential social infrastructure. As like Jim Burke, who I interviewed and has been a great, he invites me back all the time, said of his neighbors, we all know each other now. Speaking to this idea of social infrastructure, I really feel like the lessons of what's being learned in Jackson Heights can be applied not only throughout New York City, but in so many streets where, we have huge capacity to use streets as public places. And we have this very lived experience of having experimented with them during the pandemic to turn them into the places we needed. I think they're great venues for building the kind of social infrastructure that we need.
Yeah. Randy, if it isn't evident yet of why we've asked Allie to come and speak at this Place Summit, I mean, the intent of the summit and the hope and the growth and the drive of the summit is to provide a platform to celebrate the great place of Northwest Arkansas, but really kind of hone in on some of the challenges that we still face and some of the corrections we need to make, but really focused on this social infrastructure component. Why are we doing this? We're going to have sessions and breakouts and workshops throughout the 2 days that dive deep into the minutia, the engineering level and the development codes level. But starting off with a voice like Allie and like Eric last year, Majora Carter the year before, why do we care about those details? Why are we needing to keep this as the focus of Northwest Arkansas? We want to focus on the betterment of our community, the social wellness of our community. When you get to the level of development and building this community and what we've learned through that, go back hundreds of years before we were building houses on acre lots and spread out. We had that built-in natural community. So focusing on that original idea of community as we carry that over into the built environment. We're incredibly excited. I'm so excited we're getting this preview with you, Alison.
Yeah, this is really cool. Alison, for our listeners, you will be speaking at the ULI NWA Place Summit about local efforts to create resilient cities. You've talked a little bit about that throughout this podcast so far. Can you give us a preview of some of the key themes or stories you plan to share with the audience in Northwest Arkansas?
Yeah, as Megan's talking about this, land use is inextricably bound to our transportation choices. Transportation and development go hand in hand. And in the United States, the automobile is king. Since the federal highway system was created, once thriving neighborhoods have been destroyed. And today, they're relentlessly choked with pollution and traffic. Freeways enabled white flight in this country, the growth of the segregated suburbs, and disinvestment in Black and brown communities. Today, freeways pulse cars into the hearts of cities. They cost us our lives. There's something like 46,000 people died on roads in the United States in 2021. And as we're talking about examples like 34th Avenue, they've also cost us our connection to one another. You're not going to gather on the street with your neighbors if you're worried about being hit by a car. And they, I think in many horrible ways, they fuel persistent inequality. And we know that they magnify global climate change. Transportation is responsible for the greatest share of greenhouse gas emissions in the United States. And yet, roads, despite this history, are some of our most significant public places and cities. More than 100 years ago, before the highway system, before Robert Moses, streets were shared spaces, and they were used mainly by people walking and biking and riding transit. People rode on bicycles on the streets in this country as much as they ride today in cities like Amsterdam and Copenhagen, which are some of the best cycling cities in the world. And we've all had this very recent lived experience of using the hundreds of miles of streets that were closed to cars during the pandemic and open to people just because it was an emergency and they became a place that we could utilize. So they've given us the template for how roads can be used to make cities livable, how they can become more carbon free, how communities around the country are retaking them to reimagine their public right of way as places to do all kinds of things, gather, play, exercise, be entertained, just connect with one another. I said they're becoming these really important places for mutual aid and creating greater social resilience, creating greater social infrastructure that will help us to be resilient in the changes ahead. When we think about streets, we often just think about transportation, but if we free them up from cars, we can green them, make them crucial corridors for absorbing floodwaters and plant more trees on them to help mitigate the heat of climate change. Right now, we're at a moment where federal funding has the potential to multiply these kinds of programs and make them a part of emerging public infrastructure through the IIJ and IRA. So, today, what my talk is going to look at is like, what's the opportunity to make cities prioritize people over cars, make streets a solution to systemic inequality, help mitigate the effects of climate change, and become conduits of resilience. And I'll illustrate global examples because now my research has gone global for this next book, but also draw from the ground up and the examples here in the United States where that's happening already.
Yeah. One of the things that I'm thinking about is in terms of your talk, and this will be your first time to Northwest Arkansas. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. So I'm interested because I'm a city boy. I grew up right outside of New York City in the Northeast, and I've lived all over. I lived in the Bay Area, but it'll be interesting to get your take on things once you've had a chance to kind of walk on the ground here in Northwest Arkansas and see your thoughts. It's funny that you mentioned Robert Moses. The Power Broker is one of my favorite books. Robert Caro is a genius. When you think about the amount of land available in different areas, like when you come to Northwest Arkansas, one of the things that you're going to see as soon as you get here is like, wow, we've got so much land. When you go to New York, like when I landed at LaGuardia about a month or two ago, I just forgot about how on top of everything everybody is, right? And so you don't appreciate it until you're there. I tell people the first time I landed at X, all I saw were cow patties everywhere and cows. And I was like, where am I? But that has since changed. In the 10 years that I've been here, I've seen a dramatic change. I can only imagine that in the next 10 years, we are going to see so much change happen here in Northwest Arkansas. One of the questions that I have for you, and this may be asking you to speak from a premonition perspective, but how can we ensure that the growth here in Northwest Arkansas is managed sustainably and inclusively? So there's two things there: preserving the region's unique character while creating opportunities for all residents of Northwest Arkansas.
I haven't studied Northwest Arkansas, and I'm really excited to come and try and understand really the whole region better and in the time that I'm there. And hopefully this will be the beginning of a new part of my research. I have general guidance based on national trends, and maybe I will come at this through the lens, again, of transportation, since we've been focusing on that. And certainly it'll be the focus of my talk and streets. And really, how connections are made through transportation networks. As we've been discussing, transportation choices are bound to our land use patterns, like where housing is located, where we shop, where our jobs are, where our schools are. And bad systems of mass transit propagate systemic inequality. It can be one of the greatest barriers to opportunity for anyone. Not everyone can afford a car, and not everyone can drive a car. So it's really important that we invest in public transportation. For decades, we've prioritized highways over mass transit. Transportation is also responsible for the greatest share of greenhouse gas emissions. So this is something we need to tackle in the United States. This is something that this country needs to lead on. Because we've focused on highways and car infrastructure and the private automobile, and unfortunately, a lot of this is credited to Robert Moses. He, in New York City, became the template for the highway system nationally. What informed the national highways all across this country were projects that started in New York City, and the tactics that were used, eminent domain, all of those things were tried here first and then expanded into the federal highway bill. And to horrible effect. I've been studying the BQE recently and working with EJC communities there to understand this better. The Power Broker is a very relevant book at the moment in this nation's history. Because we've invested in highways and underinvested in transit, train networks, all of that stuff, we have this chance with the infrastructure bill, the IIJA and the IRA, to really repurpose our roadways, to invest in mass transit, to reconnect communities that have been harmed by this infrastructure. But it relies on something crucial, which is state DOTs. And state DOTs did not necessarily, if they reinvest in building and expanding highways, we will come out of this era with much worse outcomes, right? And there was a study recently from Transportation for America that shows 25% of the current IIJA funding has already gone to highway expansion. which has been hailed as addressing climate change, could actually worsen it if we don't turn this around. And that's just looking at climate change. We're not even talking about the effects that highways have on health and equality. And this persistence really ignores the long-term demands of the environmental justice community. So it's crucial that we hold state DOTs accountable for lowering vehicle miles traveled, for lowering greenhouse gas emissions, as Colorado has done. The Colorado DOT, under the leadership of a remarkable woman named Shoshana Liu, who's the first woman to hold that office, has actually done this. And they're creating a template for the country. When we're talking about creating regional connections in Northwest Arkansas and everywhere, we need to not underwrite the harm to the last 100 years. We need to find new ways to move people to think about transportation in ways that put an end to systemic disparities in our country.
So my translation for all that is light rail and bike lanes for everyone, right? It's the long and short of it. No, I love that actually. And it's so funny because I was thinking about, as I get an opportunity for the third time to host a Place Summit event, there was actually a quote that I wanted to share from Robert Carroll, which after what you just said, I am going to share about how one person ultimately one unelected individual had such power in some of the decision-making that individual proffered up. We're still dealing with it for decades later. I think it's going to be really interesting. I want to be responsible in terms of your time, and I so appreciate you taking time out of your busy schedule, and you too, Megan, for joining us today. I'm going to throw this last question out to both of you. Alison, I'll let you go first, and then Megan, I'll let you close out. And Alison, if you want to mention the code for your book, that would be great too, because anybody listening to this will have access to getting a copy of Alison's book with a discount, which we really appreciate you doing. But the Place Summit does aim to be a convergence of inspiration, an incubator of new ideas, and a network for those passionate placemaking individuals striving to create quality places that people want to live, work, play, and learn in. And so with that said, and it's a true statement, I've walked away from every Place Summit with incredible insight and just encouragement as I move forward and through life. Alison, what are you most looking forward to at the ULI NWA Place Summit? And then I'll pose that same question to you, Megan.
Well, I've had a wonderful relationship with ULI. I got a chance to speak at ULI Philadelphia last year and bring together 3 different practitioners involved in shaping green infrastructure in Philadelphia, which I talked about in the book. And it was really a wonderful experience for me. ULI is an organization that thinks very deeply and progressively about land use. I'm looking forward to connecting with the people there, addressing how the built environment and land use can be a part of addressing our climate challenges. And I think this goes from equitable transit-oriented development to mitigating heat and flooding through green infrastructure. This is in a region that has already been impacted by the effects of climate change, and we can measure it in more frequent heat waves, in more extreme storms. I'm excited to meet with the people on the ground there that are working both in public and in the private sector that want to make a difference. And I really believe that together we can make cities the product of choices we make about how we want to live.
Yeah, this episode's going to come out well in advance of the Place Summits. There will be a lot of thought leaders that will have access to this information, to your comments. I hope that people get in touch with you even before the event, and we'll make sure that all your contact information is on the show notes, as well as the discount code, which is the word ground. The website to go to for that is islandpress.com, and you could look up From the Ground Up at Island Press, and then you use the discount code GROUND for a 20% discount off Alison's book. We will also have copies of Alison's book for sale at the Place Summit, so you can get a copy there. And I'm going to make sure that I mention this to David Johnson at the Fayetteville Public Library and some of the other library directors here in Northwest Arkansas to make sure they get this book in the library, because we need to have a placemaking space at every library here in Northwest Arkansas, collecting all of these good books like Bruce Katz's New Localism, Daniel Perolich's book, Missing Middle, Alison's book. The conversation extends beyond this podcast. This is just a comma at the end of this conversation. We have to continue that conversation. We have to read more. We have to take insight from different ones that have been placemakers, especially in the United States. When you talk about a Robert Moses and others, I think it's important for us to keep that in mind. With that said, Megan, I'm going to give you the last word before I close out this episode and give everybody the reason why they should come out and attend the Place Summit at the end of November 2024. After the fact, just stay in touch with and connect with ULI NWA because they have events throughout the year. They have so many different amazing programs. And if you have even an inkling of interest in placemaking, especially here in the place that you call home of Northwest Arkansas, you need to be involved with the Urban Land Institute of Northwest Arkansas. So, Megan, I'm going to give you the floor.
Thank you, Randy. And speaking of the bookstore comment that you made, I want to give one quick shout out. I think there are some bookstores already that have that kind of intentionality. One that just mentioned him for your sake, Alison, too. Two Friends Bookstore located in Bentonville reached out to us as a source for the book. They're familiar with Alison's work, and that's a great point. It needs to be more accessible. I choose to live in the world that a lot of the lack of uptake in some of the conversations that we have is pure awareness or continued conversation around it. I think a lot of people make decisions based on the information they're provided. If they've only known a certain way of living that isn't necessarily community focused or connected transportation, that's all they know. I completely advocate that statement of how do we get books like Alison's out in public viewing as often as possible because we can continue to use that support for our built environment professionals. Randy, we will be back in 2025, most likely back in Fayetteville. So far, we've been bouncing back and forth between our two major downtown areas. For this summit in particular, this is our second year back in Bentonville. What is intentionally different about this year's summit? Not that we didn't want to make it happen the years past, but this is the first year we feel like we've been able to make it. There's a real concerted focus on the region as a whole. Our actual theme this year is regional connectivity, distinct communities, and shared future. So how do we, as 31 municipalities of Northwest Arkansas, that's a very unique format compared to many other MSAs around the country, how do we continue to keep that identity in our built environment, in distinct communities, but really work and think as a region as a whole? A lot of our conversations around infrastructure, housing, transportation specifically are going to be under that auspice of regional connectivity. We're hosting a workshop this year that one of the goals of the Place Summit is to be a place where we discover, we immerse ourselves, but we have this deliver element. So aside from just having great connections and learning, which is always valuable, how do we have something deliverable that comes out of it? How do we take these conversations to the next level? We're having a regional infrastructure focused workshop, bringing in key stakeholders around that topic, but also Place Summit attendees and those passionate about that conversation to get people in the room that may not be able to get connected to each other otherwise and being at the Place Summit, hear some of their struggles and challenges, and at bare minimum, really get the conversation to going on what are some of those next steps that we need to be doing now to get ahead of the even more growth that's coming into our area. So I'm really excited about this deliver piece that's going to come out of this summit. Especially if you are a built environment professional, which developer, architect, finance world, community activist, just community interest in the built environment. Anybody that, if anybody that wants to come, 20th and 21st, downtown Bentonville will be hubbed at the Record right downtown, but we'll be doing some sessions and tours and receptions throughout Bentonville area. We'd love to have you there. This is the place where everybody's in the room at the same time. And if you want to be a part of that conversation, this is the place to be. So,
I mean, it really is a great event. I have to say it, and it's not because I'm hosting it. It's a great event because of the difference that it can make in the 48 hours that it exists. And so I want to encourage everybody listening to this to really think about coming out to that event. They send young people out. Thaden has sent young people from their classes to participate in the Place Summit. So it's not just, gatekeep to adults. We want the next generation thinking about, right, Allison? If you're thinking about your kids are thinking about what do they want too, right? I think it's important that we get everybody involved in this, and that includes young people. So yeah, I'm excited about the Place Summit. I encourage everybody to participate. I want to thank you both for taking time out of your Friday morning to be with us for this recording of the I Am Northwest Arkansas podcast. Thank you both, Alison Sant. I appreciate you. Megan Brown, I appreciate you as well. And Allison, I look forward to hearing you on the stage at the Place Summit in a couple of weeks.
Thank you. And Randy, thank you for this wonderful invitation, and Megan for your leadership and for the invitation to join you at the conference. I'm really looking forward to all of it.
We're excited to have you there.
Absolutely.
Thanks, Randy.
Well, folks, there you have it. Another episode of the I Am Northwest Arkansas podcast. I am excited to participate in the Place Summit once again, and honored that ULI NWA has entrusted me with the ability to steward this event for a third time. So if you're wondering what all the fuss is, I encourage you to come out and participate. Hang out with me for a couple of days. It should be a lot of fun. Remember, our podcast comes out every Monday, rain or shine. We've got some amazing podcast episodes coming up in the near future, so we encourage you to tune in. If you enjoy this podcast, please share it with a friend. Remember, sharing is caring, and we would love a review on Apple Podcasts. If this podcast really helps you out, informs you, keeps you up to date on all the cool things happening in Northwest Arkansas, we would love a shout out from you, and just let us know how we're doing. We read every single review that we get. That's all I have for you this week. We'll be out here next week with another brand new episode of the I Am Northwest Arkansas podcast, talking about all things business, culture, entrepreneurship, and life right here in the Ozarks. I'm Randy Wilburn, your host, and we'll see you soon. Peace.
We hope you enjoyed this episode of I Am Northwest Arkansas. Check us out each and every week, available anywhere that great podcasts can be found. For show notes and more information on becoming a guest or sponsor, visit IamNorthwestArkansas.com. We'll see you next week on I Am Northwest Arkansas.